There is something sinister about the coastline of the British Isles, which stretches for some 7,000 miles. It's home to grand hotels and picturesque promenades. On the surface, there are bright lights and funfairs, sandy beaches and beautiful sunsets. But dig a little deeper in the sand and you uncover an underworld of murder and mayhem. In Coastal Killers, we take a journey to the cliff's edge, where the land meets the sea and life meets death. A shoreline that is awash with tales of death and depravity. These are the chilling true stories of Britain's worst coastal killers. In the 1970s, in Brighton on the south coast of England, gangs of Hells Angels ruled the town. Today, we look at the murder of one young gang member there, killed by one-time friends in a deliberately brutal and shocking way.
There was quite a level of violence in the Mad Dogs culture.
The killing of Clive Olive fitted the culture of the Mad Dogs wannabe Hells Angels gang.
They want to be seen as hard. They think they are these big, tough nuts and they've got to be seen to kill him in a certain way.
If you're on the inside and you break its rules, then God help you, because there will be no mercy.
It is sending a message to other people not to act like him. This is Brighton in the early 1970s. It's a busy town then as now.
1973, Britain is on the cusp of changing. And Brighton, where this took place, and Shoreham, is reflecting this period of change.
Brighton has always been famous for its kind of counterculture, for being a bit different. And if you think about it, you've gone through the 60s into the 70s. Teenagers are trying to find a new identity for themselves, a new generation of teenagers. They want a different identity.
In the 60s, Brighton had been infamous for fights between gangs of mods and rockers. Mods, smart young men on scooters; rockers, greasy motorcycle gangs, and they fought pitched battles, running battles in the streets of Brighton. It always had that slightly seedy underbelly, but by 1973, all of this is changing, just as Britain is changing.
It was a fairly cosmopolitan area, and the youth just attracted to it.
The 60s are over. What you're getting now are very much more violent, very much more criminally minded Hells Angels gangs.
You've got the Mad Dogs, who are kind of a branch of Hells Angels, popular in just the Brighton area. So you have a lot of teenagers kind of leaving school, looking for something to do, and they get drawn into this culture of Hells Angels because it gives them this sense of belonging.
And the violence that will follow is symptomatic of the changing era of Britain at exactly the point where Clive Olive was murdered.
Clive Olive was a typical kind of convert to the Hells Angels cause, if you like. He was 16, he was looking at what he was going to do with his life, didn't really want to stay at school, so he started an O-level course, then dropped out, had various kind of short-term jobs in local restaurants, and talking about becoming a baker, but wasn't kind of that interested. So he kind of got drawn into the kind of subcultures of Brighton, kind of drug culture, Hells Angels culture.
He was known as a very shy, introverted young man, and I believe that he wanted a little bit more of a personality. He wanted to be accepted by his peers.
Ollie lived with his mum, Pauline. In 1973, he had left school. He seems to have been a little bit of a drifter, but his main passion was the Mad Dogs motorcycle club.
Clive Olive was a young tearaway. He was a kid that was basically had been brought up to be a good lad, but had gone with the wrong company and gone with the wrong company quite a few times. He was a bit of a loner. He was fairly successful with girls, but he was someone who was going to accumulate a massive kind of police record by the time he was older.
When he first joined, and when Pauline first found out about it, she thought that it was just a bunch of local youth trying, as she put it, to find their own identities. It was just, again, as she put it, just a bit of fun. The reality was very different. The Mad Dogs inhabited a world of drugs, sex, and violence. Ollie was enthusiastic about all of the above.
He's a kid who thinks he's hard. There's no way at 16 he would have been a member of the Hells Angel chapters. No way. But there was a subgroup of kids who thought they were in a gang.
The Mad Dogs were a group of quasi-Hells Angels who were active around the Brighton area at the time. Hells Angels, of course, are known as a motorcycling group, but they just didn't have bikes. Hells Angels were quite a new phenomenon. There were only about 3,000 in the UK at that time, and they were thought of as being very frightening. Most of them were thought of as being violent, most of them were semi-literate. They were thought of as taking drugs, LSD and harder drugs, and they reckon that at about any one time about a third of their number would be in prison. They were very much subject to the moral panic in the UK.
With the Hells Angels, there is kind of like a traditional attraction. They'd been on the go for quite a while. They were established and they were feared, fairly universally feared. They lived outside the law entirely. They made their own rules and they made people stick by them to the letter. The whole initiation process was fairly horrific, and once you'd undergone and submitted, if you like, to the will of the group, then you were part of the group and you would defend that group till your death.
He'd been through an initiation ceremony which was quite horrendous. Apparently it took place on the beach and it involved every single member of the Mad Dogs urinating on his clothes.
The whole of the group, the whole of the Mad Dogs contingent would do that, and he's not allowed to wash those and he has to wear them immediately whilst wet.
If you join the church, you have to be baptised. If you join the Freemasons, you have to go through rituals. Any organisation, even universities, we have to go through rituals. The whole idea of rituals is to make you a member of an organisation.
They're usually unpleasant because they're designed to draw people together. You give each other a sense of identity. You're all very similar. You all have to go through this ritual, so it binds you together. And if it's something unpleasant, A, you're showing how strong you are by tolerating it, but also it ensures that you keep it secret. You keep it to within your group because you don't want to necessarily boast about it to people outside of that group.
No, if you're a Hells Angel, they're going to urinate on your clothes, they're going to do things like that. That's ritual, but that is to separate you from the rest because you're now a member of this gang.
And it's that denigrating process which means that you have been totally shamed and only they know the shame you've been through. Therefore, you are bonded to that group by that shame.
It gives you that sense of identity, and it doesn't seem to matter how unpleasant it is, people will do it in order to be part of that group.
Clive went through such a complete change. He went from being a quiet, introverted boy to somebody who was aggressive, who took drugs, who slept around, who threw up his college course because he was no longer interested. He suddenly became the sort of man who wanted to pick fights, who was very aggressive, who was always trying to show what a hard man he was. Clive in particular was known by the nickname of the 10p Romeo because he reckoned that he could bed any girl for the price of a cup of coffee. And he wasn't too particular about whether he stole other people's girlfriends or not, and he also wasn't very good at keeping his mouth shut. So when he did have a conquest, he bragged about it.
He started relationships with women. He saw himself as being very successful with women and used to brag about how easy he could get into relationships. So he didn't really have much long-term ambition. He was just looking for kind of like the next hit almost, kind of drink, drugs, girls. So it's easy to see how he was assimilated into this culture.
His downfall wasn't drugs, wasn't money, it was sex.
About a year before the incident, Clive Olive had a girlfriend. When she was 16, Clive pushed himself on her.
On her 16th birthday, she went to visit Clive Olive at his flat, believing that his mother would be there. His mother wasn't there. Clive was at the flat alone, and in short, he raped her.
He raped her and thought no more about it. He didn't think any more about it until that young girl became the girlfriend of a senior member of the Mad Dogs, a man called Brian Moore, a 21-year-old man from Brighton. And Brian Moore was the very last person Clive Olive should have wanted to cross.
Clive Olive was now about to find himself on the wrong side of one of the most dangerous men in Brighton, and incurring this man's wrath would cost him his life. Clive Olive was a teenage biker gang member who was about to anger the gang's leader, Brian Moore, with fatal consequences.
Brian Moore is quite a horrible character, actually. He comes across with very few mitigating traits. He was a scaffolder locally, a manual labourer, kind of in and out of work. He's very possessive, so in relationships he wants to be possessive of the woman he's with. He wants to kind of own them. He doesn't like the idea of women having sex with anyone else apart from him.
Moore lived with his sister, Christine, who was also in the gang and was known as Butch, and Christine's husband, Albert Dawn. They lived together in this shabby council house on an estate in Brighton. I mean, the house was a shrine to all things Hell's Angels. There were swastikas on the wall. There was a portrait of Adolf Hitler. And Moore and his sister, Christine, were known and had been known on the estate for years as tearaways.
Brian Moore was a psychopathic, narcissistic individual who was well adapted to the ways and wherefores of the Mad Dogs and any other branch of Hell's Angels. He was someone who was, as it were, fairly focused on crime. He would not think twice about committing crimes, about committing violence to others, with or without reasonable motivation.
Moore and his sister, Christine, lived with their father initially, and their father couldn't control them. His way of trying to control them was to beat them, and he beat them so severely that the police were called. The father only stopped beating Moore and Christine after the police warned that he would be taken to court if he didn't.
Moore was somebody who would never hesitate to use violence to get his own way in any context. His kind of psychopathic traits, his inability to empathise with others, made him someone who would be a danger no matter where this occurred. Even a trivial argument over property would turn into violence. It would not really have any limits as far as he was concerned, because he didn't really feel the consequences of what he was doing.
There was a revealing incident that the police discovered about Moore prior to the murder of Clive Olive. Moore had taken a job as an animal trainer and was plainly having mental health problems, because when his then girlfriend finished with him, Moore climbed into a cage with 2 leopards, hoping they would eat him. This man had severe mental health problems and an absolute inability to control his emotions.
He was your typical hard man, very aggressive and very, very possessive over his girlfriend. It was for him love at first sight, and she was his possession rather than his girlfriend.
So by the time Brian Moore discovers that his new girlfriend has been raped by Clive Olive, Moore is essentially a hand grenade waiting to go off.
She was kind of a good conquest for him because she was from a good background. She was a grammar school girl. He starts a relationship with her, and his first concern is whether she's had any sexual experience before she started dating him, because he wants to know that she's a virgin, that he's her only boyfriend. She admits that she's had sexual activity before with Clive Olive.
She confided in Moore what had happened with Clive Olive, the fact that he had raped her. And this, Moore was incensed by. His kind of narcissism rose up, and it was not something he would tolerate in any way, shape or form.
Knowing that Brian has this attitude, knowing that he doesn't want to think that she's had sex before, that perhaps encourages her to tell him that she was raped by Olive on her 16th birthday. She makes clear that this, oh yes, I've had sex, but it wasn't my fault, I was raped.
Moore vowed that he was going to get revenge. The fact that affected their relationship, it affected their sex life.
He gets Jane to recreate this rape on the part of Olive. He wants to recreate it with him in the part of Olive, which isn't a normal thing to do, and it shows that there's some sort of level of anger and desire to control on his part that's very, very evident throughout his relationships.
Moore, in his own words, went berserk. He was consumed with rage at this, absolutely determined to punish Ollie, to ensure that Ollie could never rape another girl ever again.
He wants to do something to exact revenge, to kind of show this ex-boyfriend that he's now in control. And so he makes this plan to kill him. And so he engages his sister and her husband into a plot to do something about this difficult young man.
One night in February 1973, Brian Moore, his sister Christine and her husband Albert Dawn climb into a van and drive.
They intend to pick Clive Olive up and get him beaten up. However, the first time they go and pick him up, they realise they've forgotten the weights they want to tie his body with and throw him into the sea. So they have to make up some excuse about meeting him on a different night for a drug deal. Oh, you know, we've heard we can get drugs for you, why don't you meet us again tomorrow?
The next day, they turn up well planned. They've got blocks of concrete, they've got ropes, they've got plastic bags, and they've got weapons.
In order to lure Clive Olive to his death, the gang brought along one of their female partners to lull him into a false sense of security.
Women aren't supposed to murder. Women are supposed to be nurturing, they're supposed to be soft, and they're supposed to be kind and sweet, and people don't think of women as murderers. They used Christine Dawn, who was pregnant at the time, as a lure to actually get Clive Olive into the van.
Albert Dawn is driving the van. Where's Brian Moore? He's in the back of the van, waiting to ambush Ollie.
Once he was in the van, Moore directly questioned him about his girlfriend and what had happened. And Clive, unfortunately, bragged that he had sex with her, but he sealed his fate at that point.
When Clive admitted that he had, Dawn promptly began to beat him with a truncheon and his fists and his feet.
He's got a truncheon, he's smashing him, crashing him. in his words, on the head and the arms. And he beats him until he believes he's dead.
Brian says he thinks he's dead. They then tie his hands behind his back.
Then tied concrete blocks around his ankles, around his hand, and around his body. So clearly they intended to dispose of his body, kill him and dispose of his body.
They drove to Shoreham and onto the beach. They dragged him from the van, and Albert and Moore began to push him and pull him and throw him into the sea so that he actually sank and they could see the bubbles rising.
What they hadn't realised was that although they thought Ollie was dead, he was still breathing. When he went into the water, he was still breathing. He died essentially from drowning.
Long as they couldn't actually prove it, I'm sure Brian Moore would have been chuffed to have that reputation of a made man, to use the mafia code. I mean, there's a danger if there was enough evidence to show that he had killed, but if it was just a hint, then he would enjoy that. I mean, that would make him a much bigger man in Brighton, much more of a danger, and respect goes with that.
This is very much a kind of gangster killing. It kind of fits with the whole image of the Hells Angels as this gang not to be messed with. There is a kind of clear intention here to show a certain level of violence, a certain manner of death, so that if and when his body is discovered, it is sending a message to other people not to act like him. And it also kind of makes you think that they've got kind of convinced by their own image. They want to be seen as hard. They think they are these big, tough nuts, and they've got to be seen to kill him in a certain way.
With Clive Olive sent to a watery grave, Moore and the Mad Dogs might have thought that they had committed the perfect murder. But as is so often the case, the sea would eventually surrender her secrets. The south coast seaside towns of Brighton and Shoreham had been the scene of the brutal revenge killing of a teenager called Clive Olive. And for the man who killed him, there were no regrets, just a sense of satisfaction at a job well done.
Brian Moore seems to certainly lack any sort of empathy or regret or anything like that after he's killed Clive Olive. And it's clear that he never did express regret for it. He thought that he'd got what he deserved, and he was convinced that he'd done the right thing. And so you can clearly see how he's done this act of violence. He thinks he's right. He's got this power. He is the hard man. He would know that people would respect him in a certain way if they'd known that he'd done this. It feeds his ego. He thinks he is this big gang figure who can bump off people who offend him.
They largely went about their business. They cleaned the van, they resprayed it. The truncheon that they'd used as a weapon, they broke in half and disposed of on Brighton racecourse. And there was a little bit of a frisson around the area in that people knew that something had happened. They knew that Clive was missing. They knew that something had happened to him, but a lot of people were too afraid to speak out.
And that's how it would have stayed, with Ollie's body rotting on the floor of Shoreham Harbour underneath hundreds of feet of water, had it not been for the fishing boat which snagged the body and brought it to the surface and revealed the fact of his murder.
It was about 6 weeks. A Dutch tanker pulled into Shoreham Harbour and caused the waters to be disturbed, and Clive's body, which was pretty much bloated with gas, floated up to the surface. It had been largely eaten by crabs, and there wasn't a lot of the body left over.
It gives the press a real feeding frenzy. This is a kind of unusual story. It kind of also plays into these concerns about how teenagers are living their lives, what happens when you drop out of school and you kind of go into the fringes of society. This is what can happen to you. So there's lots of things making this a really newsworthy story. And It's easy to forget actually how young Clive Olive was, the fact that he was only 16 and yet he's been killed in such a brutal manner. You know, this is kind of an unusual story and very, very newsworthy.
It was plain from the condition of the body that it had been in the water for several weeks. And that means it had been eaten away by fish, the water had done damage, the body was badly decomposed. But there was something else about that body which told the police that what we're dealing with is a murder. Somebody had strapped concrete blocks to its legs. That doesn't happen with a suicide. Somebody had deliberately weighted that body down when they threw it into Shoreham Harbour in the hope that it would never be recovered.
It sounds like what you would expect on a proper gangster mafia or anything type murder, where you are clearly disposing of the body. The whole idea of concrete is to weigh down the body, because normally where people make the mistake is they throw somebody in the sea and they forget, they come up as floaters and you find the body. So by putting concrete on them, you're keeping them on the seabed or the riverbed. That is classic serious gangsters. So are they trying to mimic that? Or have they learned? Have they been sensible enough to learn that if you're going to have a body, you must avoid it being a floater? You don't want the body floating a few days or weeks to after you bury it in the sea. And the longer the gap between when somebody's killed and when they find the body, the better that is for the killer. It gives them a lot more freedom of opportunity. The last thing you want to do is have a body found very, very quickly.
Body recovery, in terms of bodies that have been put into water, it's a logistical challenge, let's put it that way. In this particular case, that body has been in that water body for some time, and that is in itself going to make forensic recovery very difficult, unfortunately. So a team is usually dispatched to that area, whereby we try and carefully remove the body from the water. In this particular case, it's been associated with a concrete block originally, so we know that it has been at depth in this water body, which has exposed the body to various animal activity. Fish have obviously had a sort of an impact on the body itself. We've had currents and things like that, which will have all undermined the security of that body structure. So the recovery from the water body would have been horrendous, frankly. From a forensic perspective, then usually there are a number of changes that occur to that body. First of all, it starts to decompose, and if the body has been injured in any way, so it's sustained a blood injury, then that area can be seen as a food source to any animals and creatures that live in the water body. So they'll become very extensive very quickly in that context. The body will start to swell, the water starts to incur into the various tissues, so we start to get major changes in terms of the context of the body. And of course then we start to degrade relatively rapidly, such that all of our soft tissues start to change such that they're not recognisable when that body is ultimately removed from the water. In actual fact, by wrapping the body in plastic, you're actually retaining more evidence than would have been retained had it have just simply been placed in the water body and currents would be able to wash over it to remove that evidence. Stitching all of the elements together in terms of where the assault originally took place, how the body was transported to the deposition site, then subsequently what happened to the body after it went into the water. It makes stitching all of that together very, very difficult. It's all dealt with in a very isolated fashion, essentially.
Sussex police quickly realised that the remains, and they were remains, matched the rough description of a 16-year-old youth who'd been missing for almost 2 months. The body was that of a young man, and there were the remains of a tattoo, a crude tattoo, still just about visible on the arm, in which there was a heart pierced by an arrow and 3 letters just about visible underneath, H-A-C.
The tattoos that were all, although they were faded, they were still evident in the skin of this person, so they could be used to help with identification. I mean, there's no question that there were other things that can be used to identify, but such as dental records and such like. But at the end of the day, if you've also got this tattoo, which is pretty diagnostic or pretty characteristic of that individual, that can be placed on top of other information that help in conclusively identifying who that person is.
Tattoos are really important in this story. You've got the fact that Clive Olive's body is identified by the fact he's got a tattoo marking him as a cougar, which was a kind of a teenage run gang kind of that they tried to establish as an alternative to the Mad Dogs. You've also got the fact that so much attention is given to the fact that the 18-year-old girl in the case, Christine, is covered in tattoos. So this is seen as a real sign of kind of like the subculture of the time, the fact that these young people are getting these tattoos to give them an identity, to associate themselves with a gang. And the fact that it's one of the few things remaining on Clive Olive's body that enables the police to identify who he is.
HAC stood for Hells Angels Cougars, a local youth gang that Ollie had been associated with. And when the police began investigating that club, they found that Clive Olive was very far from an angel himself.
They realised that he'd been murdered, obviously, because he had things strapped to his legs, blocks of concrete, and they managed to trace the blocks of concrete and the plastic bags and the rope that had been used to a nearby building site. The owners of the building site had discovered that these things had been stolen, and the building site was very close to the houses of Moore and the Dawns. Moore eventually crumbled under police questioning. He claimed that because Clive Olive had been conscious when he was thrown into the water, his eyes had been staring directly at Moore and they'd been giving him nightmares. They'd frightened him. But Moore felt very much as though he'd done Brighton a favour, as though he'd removed a man who had raped and was now never going to rape again.
When you read the stories of the parents of those involved, it's quite interesting that you get 2 completely different pictures. With Brian and Christine, their father was interviewed and he said he couldn't understand how they'd ended up the way they had when he'd always been so violent towards them as a means of discipline. So he talks about the fact that they could feel the imprint of his hand on their buttocks after he'd hit them. The neighbours had complained about him because they'd heard him beating his children up and called the police, and the police told him he wasn't allowed to beat them up anymore. And he was really quite affronted by this because he said, if I'd been allowed to carry on beating them up, they wouldn't have committed violence themselves, and completely failed to see how actually his attitude towards them might have made them more violent. Conversely, you've got Clive Olive's mother, who was incredibly saddened by what had happened to him, who recognised how he'd gone off the rails. And she was saying that she'd wanted him to stay at school. She'd been encouraging him to get qualifications, to get a career. But once he turned 16, she couldn't get any sense into him. He wouldn't listen to her anymore. And all she could do was watch as he went off the rails. It's a real contrast in parenting styles, and the children all went off the rails despite these differences in parenting. They couldn't do anything regardless of how they brought their children up. They were going to go their own way anyway.
With Clive Olive's killers now apprehended, the scene was set for a murder trial that would send a shockwave across the waters of the south coast. The seaside town of Brighton was about to play host to a trial into the murder of teenager Clive Olive. And going into the trial, his murderer Brian Moore said he was haunted by his crimes. But would anyone buy it?
Moore claimed that he never really slept properly, that he was having disturbing flashbacks, and he always had that image of Clive's eyes staring at him. staring back at him as it disappeared into the water, and that it would disturb him for the rest of his life.
I think Brian Moore's very cynical, and he's quite a tough nut. I don't think he regretted what he'd done in any way, shape or form. And the way he says that he was kind of haunted by Clive Olive's eyes, I don't believe. I think this is a story he's saying because he feels he ought to, and he doesn't really believe it. I don't think he felt any remorse from when that body went into the water, and never showed it afterwards.
If you've just killed somebody, then just seeing their eyes open or closed is not going to make that much difference. I would have thought the process of actually battering somebody to death, putting concrete around what you consider a dead body, is much more traumatic than just simply opening their eyes.
In court, Moore was not showing remorse. One way of getting some kind of court sympathy is to show remorse for your victim. He showed none. In fact, he was proud. He was kind of bragging that, you know, he'd rid the world of a possible rapist and saved, you know, lots of young ladies from being attacked. Moore was somebody who could only see himself in a good light. He was a narcissist. He was psychopathic. He had no feelings whatsoever for his victim. In fact, he was proud of what he did.
As the court case unfolded, details of Moore and the Mad Dog's violent lives were laid bare.
The Hells Angels had caused somewhat of a moral panic in the area, in that they were judged as an unwelcome import from America. Nobody wanted them there. And the amount of violence that they'd used in the case appalled people, frightened them. Brian Moore was very aggressive. He screamed at the judge, he screamed at the barristers, he told them to shut up or he would get them. He threw bottles of water around. Meanwhile, the Dawns tried to place all the blame on Moore. They said that they hadn't done anything and that Moore had intimidated them, and that they only went along with the plan because they were frightened of Moore.
If you look at Christine Dawn, who was involved in the Hells Angels, this is Brian's sister, her attitude in court, her presence does not denote a victim or a woman who saw herself as a victim. She was a strong woman too. You know, she's described as being tattoo covered. She's 18 but heavily pregnant. She's very much her own woman.
Moore's girlfriend, the young woman that Olive had attacked and who had become the catalyst for the murder, emerged during the trial as a sympathetic figure who had lived in fear of the gang. Moore's desire to control women was part of his dangerous psychopathology.
Moore clearly had what was the beginnings of a psychopathic personality disorder. He saw himself as judge, jury, and executioner. Clive Olive had transgressed the rules of the Mad Dogs Club. He, Brian Moore, one of the senior members of the club, he says this at trial. He was going to take it on himself to make sure that Ollie never raped another girl again. Now, what does that tell you? He doesn't say to his girlfriend, should we talk to the police? He doesn't go to the police himself. He doesn't try and rough up Ollie, who's 16, who's 5 years younger than him. He decides he's going to execute him. Judge, jury, executioner, end of.
Yeah, we have a legal system for a reason, and the legal system should be used rather than people doling out their own punishment.
If you're wrapping concrete around a body, the body becomes incredibly heavy. So it would take at least 2, if not 3 people to carry that body out far enough so that it could be dropped into the sea. That's why we know that Albert Dawn had to be involved.
It was clear to the court that Moore could not have worked alone. In one final twist, perhaps the most telling thing about Moore as a murderer was not his method of murder, but how he chose to get rid of Clive Olive's body.
Moore and Albert Dawn were convicted of murder and were sentenced to life.
Christine Dawn, who had given birth to her baby by now, was found guilty of manslaughter. She was given leave to appeal, whereas the two men weren't, and at the appeal, her case was quashed because the appeal judge believed that she shouldn't have been found guilty of manslaughter. It was either murder or nothing. Moore was very, very firm in his belief that he'd done Brighton a favour. He'd got rid of somebody who he personally viewed as scum of the earth. You can argue anything as far as murder's concerned. For example, is somebody who murders his dying partner to save them agony as culpable as somebody who stabs a complete stranger on the street? Is somebody who deals one punch that knocks somebody out and knocks their head on the curb and kills them as guilty as somebody who sets up people and strangles them?
Moore plainly troubled the court, and the judge specifically warned no Home Secretary should ever consider releasing Brian Moore. But a life sentence in this country very rarely means life, and Moore and Albert Dawn have long since been let out of prison.
One odd consequence of Moore's act and his conviction was the fact that the police, held the Hells Angels as a whole under more scrutiny and would be more intrusive in their inquiries. Their recruitment took a dive, and Moore would probably not really be proud of that, but it was a direct consequence of his actions.
What sticks in my mind is that they actually did something that most people don't. They actually planned the disposal of the body. Most killers kill and then try to distance themselves from the body. The fact that he or they worked out how to dispose of the body tells us that it was clearly a murder, the intention, mens rea, everything's there. There's plenty of opportunity not to commit the murder. The fact that he did commit the murder and the fact that he disposed of the body clearly indicates a man who's capable of doing it again. I would have thought he has the characteristics of an antisocial personality, if not psychopathic personality. I think he would certainly pose a danger in the future.
On looking back at this case, one of the most shocking things about this brutal murder remains to be the young ages of all those involved.
Brian Moore was 21, Christine was 18, and the victim was 16. These are young people who should have had their lives in front of them, and instead they kind of got involved in this kind of subculture and didn't know how or when or why to get out of it. And in some cases they didn't want to get out of it because this is what gave them a sense of identity. They didn't feel there were any other meaningful options open to them. And I think when you read the story and you see the pictures, and of course the pictures to us now look quite dated, it's easy to forget that these were children, and yet look how their lives turned out.
There are always more victims when someone is murdered than the actual victim themselves. Mothers who will then blame themselves that in some way, if they'd done something different, their child would not have ended up in bad company or in the company of the killer. In this case, Clive Olive's mother was beating herself up, if you like. The idea that her son had fallen in with this wrong crowd and stuck with them and been killed by them kind of left her feeling not just guilt, not just grief, but really being quite distraught that she couldn't have done anything to dissuade him from this path.
None of those involved in this case were innocent, including the victim. But as prosecutors made clear at the time, although Clive Olive was a complex character, he did not deserve the fate that befell him.